Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first episode of the Ranx Insider. This is something I've been very excited to do, and so has Rochelle. The Ranx Insider is a podcast about podcasts, right, with a special focus on companies making podcasts or branded podcasts, which is, of course, the business that we're in. So we thought, what better to do than to make our own podcasts and really show people how it's done, right? My name is Swapnil Kamath. I am the co-founder of Ranx. This is Rochelle with me, who's part of the founding team of Ranx and the vice president of operations. Rochelle and myself, of course, have worked for a very long time together and have previously built another company called Work Better Training that was acquired by Upgrad. So we have a long experience of working together, and we're very excited about Ranx as an endeavor, and especially this podcast that we're doing together, because this is going to be the first part of first show or first part of many different episodes that we're going to shoot. Like I said, throwing light on all things podcasts with a focus on branded or business podcasts. Rochelle, how are you feeling?
Yeah, I'm excited. Finally getting started with this, Swapnil. We've been waiting. And like you said, a podcast about podcasts, right? So I love
Yeah.
that. I love that we're jumping into this. So
Jumping into
yes,
this.
let's
Okay,
jump in.
so the format that we're going to follow for this is going to be a discussion format, as I think all podcasts should be, right? All good podcasts are essentially of course, there are different kinds of podcasts, but the most popular form of podcast today is the conversation podcasts or the interview podcasts or a discussion podcast, right? And I think that is the type that is really the most popular by far, and we're going to be following the same pattern of doing it, right? So Rochelle is going to throw questions at me every week on week, and then both of us are going to discuss those questions and come up with what we think are good enough answers that can help our audience, whether they want to do a podcast through us or whether they want to launch their own business podcast or branded podcast. That's up to them. But we want to try to be of help to people. And as we are building this particular venture, there's so many insights and so much of exposure that we have to what's happening in this world. So we only thought it made sense for us to share it with people by and large all over the world, right? So that's going to be the format, and we'll keep innovating as we suggest to all our clients that they should do in our podcast. So you will see that in this podcast that we do as well, right? So you'll have different themes happening, different kind of content that gets generated, and all of it will be interesting for a podcast enthusiast and for companies that want to launch a podcast, right? So, yep, Rosh, ball in your court.
Yes, Swapnil. So first, let's directly jump in. The first question that I want us to address is, what does Ranks do? Um,
Ah,
very important. Let's start with that.
correct. So, Ranks Podcasts is going to create podcasts, video podcasts for companies, corporates, brands, right? That is what Ranks is going to do. So we are going to handle creating a podcast for you end to end, which basically means that you totally outsource the task of creating your company podcast that hopefully we run for you in perpetuity, right? Because podcasts have become such an important form of marketing in some way, right? I think it's possibly one of the most important forms of marketing today, and yet there's very little expertise that companies, corporates, brands have around it, right? So that's where we step in, and you outsource this to us. It's totally our headache then, and we create something for you which is absolutely fantastic that helps you grow your business. That's what we want, right? Because we are not in the business of creating podcasts for individuals. We are not in the business of creating podcasts for the sake of creating podcasts. We are in the business of creating podcasts for companies that help them grow their business in one form or the other.
So, Swapnil, see, you, me, Ruchira, who co-founded Work Better Training with you, right? It was an
Yeah,
executive education company.
yeah,
So, great journey there. From there, jumping to podcasts, what
Yeah,
what made it compelling? Why did you guys say that, okay, now that we've done training
yeah,
for well over a decade, now we'll
yeah.
start with podcasts?
Yeah, very interesting question, Rosh, right? And I'm going to try to be as candid as possible here, right? So the first thing, of course, was a deep love that I think all of us have for
Hmm.
podcasts, right? And I think I can say that I'm a true lover of podcasts because over the last decade or so, um, most of what I consume as learning content, educational content, and sometimes even just entertainment content,
Hmm.
all of it, the primary source has become podcasts for me over the last year, right? And it's not surprising, Rosh, right? And it's not surprising because human beings love being a part of conversations. They like being a part of it, or sometimes they love just being, fly on the wall and kind of listening to an interesting conversation, right? So it's not surprising that podcasts have taken off all over the world and the numbers are growing year on year because I see that trend myself. I possibly end up consuming anything from 60 to 90 minutes a day of different interesting podcasts, right? So it always makes sense for you to start a venture in an area that you feel passionate about, that
Yep.
that you yourself are a consumer of. And I know
Yep.
that's the same for you, that's the same for Ruchira, and a lot of people on our founding team, right? So that's number one. Number two, I think, in my experience, I have seen the benefit brands and companies have got by associating themselves with podcasts in any way, right? Because there are like two primary forms in which brands or companies associate themselves with podcasts. One could be where they come in as a sponsor,
Right.
and the other is where they create their own podcast. I think both
Yep.
these
Yep.
means are quite effective means, right, of associating yourself with podcasts. And I've seen my own behavior that I tend to trust those brands a lot more, when they have their own podcast, when I know a lot about them, or when they're associated with the right kind of podcasts, right?
Mhm.
So I saw that happening, that businesses got real benefits from creating their own podcast or associating with the right ones, right? So that was reason number two. And reason number three, as you're aware, when just the background that we gave, right? We started an executive education company, scaled that up. That company got acquired by Upgrad, and in the 3 years while I was at Upgrad running that as a business head, we started a internal podcast there, right, with our customers, and I think we did close to 25, 30 episodes of that. And it was the response that we got was fantastic, right? And we saw real business results, which I'll get into as we go on in this podcast. We saw real business results coming from us starting our own podcast, right? So it was a combination of the love that we have for podcasts and our trend as a consumer ourselves, that we're consuming so much of it. Number two, how brands and companies are benefiting when they start their own podcast. I've seen that myself as a consumer of them, and how I feel about the brand. And number three, we started our own podcast and the
Hmm.
business benefits that gave us, right? So it was a no-brainer, quite honestly, to get started and with Ranks podcast as a company.
With attention spans reducing so drastically now, right? And that's just, we're discussing it across social media, we're
Yeah,
discussing it about kids, we're
yeah,
discussing it even when it comes to professionals.
yeah,
uh Podcasts, like we said, have blown up, they've become a big deal,
yeah.
but they don't work with short attention spans. So
Hmm.
how is that different when it comes to podcasts, Swapnil?
Yeah, that's a very, again, an amazing question, right? The beauty about creating a professional podcast, right? And by professional, I mean that, doing it through people that actually understand podcasts like us gives you huge benefits, right? Now, if you think about it, a podcast, you could have a 1 hour Q&A or interview format, right? And sometimes, if you look at a Joe Rogan or the Lex Friedman podcast, those are sometimes 2 or 3 hour podcasts. Not something I would recommend for corporate podcasts or branded podcasts. But even if it's a 1 hour podcast, for a lot of people, a 1 hour is a lot of time, right? However, you can take that same podcast and make it into clips, right, around
Mm.
specific questions that people, may want answers to. And those clips could then be anything from a 3 minutes to a, 10-minute clip where a person gets a specific answer without having to go through the entire podcast. So that's one form for people with shorter attention spans. And also you can make them into the reel format or the shorts format on YouTube, which are probably, if I'm not mistaken, 1 or 2 minutes almost, right? So you can take critical parts from there and put it up there, right? Because I've realized myself, I generally prefer the long form of going through the entire podcast, but some podcasts I don't want to go through the entire thing, right? I just want
Right.
to,
Yeah. Yeah.
go through the specific clips which I think are relevant to me.
Yeah.
And, I try to control my urge of going through reels and shorts because they're so addictive. But, my feed is full of so many interesting and informative and educative reels and shorts, right? That I enjoy getting information, and knowledge in a way from there as well, right? So the beauty about podcasts is it can work for somebody that, wants to go through the entire thing. It works for somebody that wants to just devote 3 to 10 minutes to an answer, and it can cater to somebody that wants something very snackable in terms of a
Yeah.
short or a reel, and stuff like that, right?
So
And that's
that's,
why I think it ticks
yeah, yeah.
off
So
all
that's what I
boxes.
enjoy as well because
Yeah,
even if I come across a short or just like a 2 or 5 minute clip, it's
yeah,
interesting. And then if I want a deep dive,
yeah,
I can actually just go about what I'm doing and I can listen to it and I can actually gain
yeah,
insights from experts, which
yeah,
which is great. I can be doing anything and learning.
yeah,
So this format that has both, where you
yeah,
can have a deep study, a deep dive, and
yeah,
you can have your highlights, which you can
yeah,
also keep going back to. I think, in my opinion, that's the reason that podcasts really work for me.
yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Correct. And
yes.
just I think the in today's day and age, and if we, get the stat, we should put it on this video later. Today, most podcasts are consumed on YouTube, right? I'm sure that's the trend that you have seen as well, right? So we don't go to specific apps anymore for our podcasts. We go to YouTube for
Yeah.
our podcasts,
Yeah.
right? I think the second biggest forum for probably is Spotify, right, where people
Mm-hmm.
go for podcasts. So that therefore the clips, reels, all these formats have become extremely relevant from, these two or three places where people actually consume podcasts, right? A lot, right? So yeah, I see that trend continuing, and therefore it works for people that want something snackable and for people that, want to do a deep dive into a subject.
Yeah, it's become like podcasts have become a huge deal now because
Yeah,
either people are discussing some podcasts, whether it's humor, whether it's entertainment, or they
yeah,
are, listening into one, or they're starting one up. So
yeah,
many people, are starting podcasts. So many
yeah,
businesses, are starting podcasts. It's
yeah,
become a really big deal, Swapnil. So you've told
yeah.
us so much about it, but why else do you think that it's become this big a deal at this point in time?
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, right? It's become a big deal. It's very, very natural if you see your own trend, right? Like I said, people have always enjoyed conversations, right? People, even as a form of learning, we tend to learn so much through conversations, right? So that's one of the reasons why I think it's become a big deal over the world. And also, I think podcasts tend to bring a touch of informality to conversations that people really enjoy, right? So if you think of uh, all the biggest podcasts around the world, whether they're, started by companies or branded podcasts or otherwise, the minute you try to make a podcast too stuffy, right, or too formal in
Mm.
nature, they don't tend to work, right? Then it just looks like anything that you'd see on traditional TV, right? And I think the entire beauty of podcasts is a slight touch of informality, authenticity, and that being brought into this conversational format. I think that, people really enjoy, and that's why I think podcasts are growing year on year. Both the sheer amount of podcasts and the amount of time people are spending listening or watching today podcasts, right? Both things are increasing year on year in just about every part of the world, right? So it's not even a trend which is about one country or one location.
Yeah.
This is a worldwide phenomena that has happened. And if I have to just take another calculated guess, I think, like I said, right, YouTube and Spotify, both of these major channels, also doing a podcast push has helped. Of course, they go with the numbers, right? They see something is increasing and gaining popularity, and they want to latch on to that. So it's a combination of those two things that I think is really led to this global blowout of podcast listening time.
Yeah. So it's being heard, right? People want to listen to these candid conversations. And I think brands have recognized this. Brands have now started cashing in. They've
Mm,
started launching their own podcasts. In
mm.
India, not to that extent where, it's in the
Yeah.
West right now. But do you think brands should really be investing in podcast very strategically? And what do they really stand to gain by doing this?
Yeah, a good question. Of course, we have a lot of vested interest in saying
Absolutely.
that brands and companies should do podcasts. But I think the 4 or 5 points that I will share, if any brand or company or corporate pays attention to that, it's literally a no-brainer, right? They should be doing it. And each one of these 5 points, I think, in subsequent episodes, we will get into a lot more detail there, right, of what and how. They benefit companies, right? But let's get started, because I think this is the most important question, right? So the first reason for a company to start a podcast is access and engagement to key stakeholders, right? By key stakeholders, I mean primarily it could be your clients or your customers for a B2B business. A
Mhm.
key stakeholder could be, if you end up dealing with government officials, right? That it's a good way to access and engage with them. If you have a key stakeholder who's a strategic partner to your business, it could be that stakeholder. It could be a wide array, right? But a lot of companies specifically use it for access and engagement with their customers or clients, right?
Mhm.
Now, what do we mean by engagement? If you have existing clients that have been doing business with you, doing a podcast and engaging them in a brilliant conversation ends up building relationship between the brand
Mhm.
and that particular stakeholder, right,
Mhm.
in some way. And secondly, by access, we mean that a lot of salespeople, when they try to get in touch with a client, they may not give them a meeting, but in a way, if you invite that same person on a podcast to have an interesting conversation, that becomes a way in which you start an association with a
Mm.
certain stakeholder that's been difficult to reach otherwise, right?
Mhm.
So you have a lot of B2B companies that have been using podcasts as a way of accessing and engaging their most important clients, right? And it's brilliant. And like I said, this is something that we've tried ourselves, and it worked like magic, right? It worked like magic because most of your existing customers, you solidified your relationship further, and
Mhm.
led to more and more business coming from there on. I can't
Mhm.
literally think of a single customer that didn't do business with us after coming on our podcast, right?
That's the kind of success rate you're
Oh
saying.
yeah, almost 100%, right? 100% of our
Almost 100%.
yeah, 100% of our existing customers that came and did a podcast with us continue doing business with us, right? Because now our relationship had solidified in some way. Yeah, and so many of
That's so
our I don't
interesting. Sorry, I'm jumping
yeah
in, Swapnil.
yeah
That is so
yeah
interesting because
yeah
I think, like you said, it brings a personal touch.
yeah.
Do you also think it's refreshing now for stakeholders to, instead of just, sitting and doing meetings, it's refreshing now for stakeholders to say, okay, you know what, we'll come over, we'll sit, we'll have a good chat about things. Do you think
Yeah.
that freshness is also bringing value?
Of course, I think it is, right, because a lot of people are craving to have good conversations with other
Yeah.
people, right? Whether it's business or not, you're actually craving for that, right? So when you actually invite a stakeholder to have an interesting conversation with you, which is recorded, uh, you know, for him it's enjoyable, or him or her it's enjoyable in most
Right.
cases. right? So
Right.
yeah, I think there is a angle which is very refreshing there.
Mm.
And for me, right, it was as the host and somebody that was conducting the podcast, it was so much fun for me. I would look forward to doing it every week, and I could see that my guests enjoyed it as well, right? And even if I was having a conversation with them literally for the first time through a
Mm.
podcast, they totally enjoyed it. And all our subsequent meetings
Mm.
started off on a solid footing, so to speak, right?
Yeah, I can
And
see why. Absolutely.
yeah, and if it were just a normal sales call, I don't think that would have happened, right? In a normal
Yeah.
sales
Yeah.
call, right? So we've seen the magic work firsthand, like I said, right? And that's the reason why we're so bullish
Mm.
about this, right? So yeah, so number one reason for me is access and engagement to key or difficult to reach stakeholders, and that is especially for a B2B company, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the second reason I think why anyone should, any brand or company should invest in a podcast is that it helps build thought leadership, right? Now, what does it mean, helps build thought leadership? Thought leadership is essentially your ability to come across as an expert in the domain, industry, sector, or field that you operate in, right? And through a podcast, because you're having, in a lot of times, conversations connected to your industry with the different stakeholders that you call on your podcast. A lot of very interesting takes come or insights come from the host, and a lot of interesting takes or insights or expertise is shown by even the guests that come on that particular podcast, right? So a combination of that really helps build your credibility as an expert and therefore as a thought leader. And I think, in today's day and age, Rosh, being a thought leader for every company is extremely important. And again, that's the reason why we are starting this particular podcast, right, of the Ranks Insider,
Yeah.
because we
Yeah.
want to be the thought leaders in this field. Because with so much of competition, right, with so many companies fighting for the same customer in some way, customers eventually are going to want to go to the expert on a certain subject, right? And that's the way human beings have always been, and that's the way human beings have always purchased stuff, where they like going to an expert for a certain purchase or for a certain need that they have to be solved. And the same thing is going to be true here, right? You're going to want to go to the expert. So how do you build thought leadership in the modern world? The
Mm.
primary format of many things that you do, but the primary format, in my opinion, is through a podcast, right? So that's reason number two, right? To build thought leadership for your company or for your brand, right? The third reason, which I think is equally interesting, is podcasts help build trust by humanizing the brand or company, right? Now, what does this mean? What does humanizing your company mean? If you go to the social media pages of most organizations, whether they're B2B or B2C, you see a lot of generic content. You don't actually see human beings, right, interacting and having discussions. They're just regular posts that are there, or they're ads that you make, which everybody know are doctored in some
They're
way, right?
staged.
They're staged,
They're
right? So
staged.
you're making ads on one side, or you're putting your regular content right on the
Mm.
other side, right? But there's no way for companies or brands to really humanize themselves. And the minute a company humanizes themselves, right, a lot of trust starts building with the consumers, right, or the clients that are there. They're like, oh, I can see a lot of people that are actually a part of this thing. And that's what podcasts do for you, right? People,
Mm.
consumers or clients actually see the humans behind the brands, and that tends to build a lot of trust towards the brand, right?
Mm.
And that trust eventually leads to business actually taking place, right? Because I think all of us would agree that the businesses that you associate with are the businesses that you trust, right? That's when you transact with some business, right? So I think the humanizing is a very important part, right? So that would be point three. Point four, which is again very interesting, is your guests become your brand evangelists or ambassadors,
And
right?
I think that's beautiful to have.
That's beautiful, right? So what tends to happen is every time that you call somebody as a guest on your show, more often than not, that person will share that podcast on their social media
Yeah.
channels, right? So it's a de facto vote of confidence for the brand. It's without it being too pushy, somebody's actually endorsed your brand or been an ambassador for it or an evangelist for it, right? Now, if you think of it, let me give you an example, right? So, Work Better or Upgrad Work Better, when we did the podcast, right, we would call a lot of people from the HR domain and the learning and development domain because that was our target customer in some way, right? So we invited them for the podcast. Now, when they shared the podcast on their LinkedIn, their circles more often than not were other HR professionals or other learning and development
Right.
professionals,
Right.
right? So automatically, they've been brand evangelists, not generically, but they've been
Hmm.
brand evangelists on their social media to a very specific group that is again relevant to me,
Right.
right? And it was so interesting after we shot our first 10 episodes, Rosh, we had people from the industry reaching out to us proactively saying, hey, can we be guests on your podcast? Right. And that happened so quickly
Hmm.
because, again, it was shared by the guests as brand evangelists of sort
Yeah.
in their circles, which were relevant to us. Right.
And that is so
Now,
difficult to have your clients come to you.
yeah. Yeah. And it could be anyone, right?
Yeah.
Tomorrow, we could have called an academic on the
Yeah.
on the show, and he would have, shared it in his circles, which again would have brought benefits to us as a brand, right? So your guests becoming brand evangelists is a testimonial of sort that they're giving you, is like the ultimate word of mouth that they're giving you, and that by default happens every time a guest is featured on a podcast, right? Because the guest is sharing so much of interesting information, he wants his audience to
Hmm.
to hear that, right, in some way. So that's the fourth very specific point why brands should start a podcast. And lastly, I would say the fifth point is every brand, most brands and their social media, which is a very important part of their marketing mix, is extremely boring. And most brands don't have a clue as to what they need to do on their social media, right? So, as a part of the podcast, you end up creating a lot of interesting video content that you pump on your social media, right? And all of us know that today videos on all kinds of social media is what companies need to share to get the right kind of traction on their social media, right? So by default, you doing a podcast, you get, the whole video, you get the clips, you get the shots, so much of video content that a company wouldn't get otherwise, and they know that video content is very important for their social media, right? So a combination of these 5 points that are, that largely work for both B2B and B2C, which is, number one, like access and engagement to your key stakeholders, right? Number two, building your thought leadership, right? And now, number three, you're humanizing your brand and building trust with your clients and consumers, right? Number four, your clients, the people that you call on the guests become your brand evangelists and ambassadors by sharing it on their social media. Number five, you create amazing video content for your own social media platforms, right? A combination of these five things makes it an absolute no-brainer for any brand, every brand company or corporate to really, start their own. And if I may add, start it through us because we're the experts at this particular subject, right? So of course, take everything that we're saying with a pinch of salt because we're,
Mm.
we're pushing our own agenda in some way. But I think it's hard to refute the logic behind the 5 points that have been shared, right? I think they are quite logical in
Yeah.
nature.
Yeah.
Yeah,
With
that's
these
why.
5 points, Swapnil, tell
Yeah.
me, do you think this hype and the hula hoo around podcasts is here to stay? Because we see so many different trends that, start off and everybody's gets all excited and then it fizzles out. Do you
Hmm.
think this one's here to stay? Or at least
Yeah.
stay for the long term? Clearly, you've started a company. I've joined you. We
Yeah.
believe it,
Yeah.
but let's break that down.
Yeah. First of all, I think podcasts have now been around for a very, very
Mm,
long time, right? So it's not like we're coming and proposing something which is brand new, right? And
mm,
whether it's internationally or in India, it's been around for a while,
mm,
right? When I look at stuff, I look at stuff from the lens of do humans inherently enjoy a certain thing or not? Right. And I think exactly like human beings inherently enjoy stories, and therefore TV shows and movies are here to stay. Right now you may watch
yeah,
them in a theater versus watch them on a big
yeah,
screen at home versus watching them on your phone, right? That
mm,
could change, right? But I don't think TV shows or movies, right? We still watch both, and we
mm,
consume probably more than we would earlier,
mm,
right? Because human beings enjoy being entertained, they enjoy stories, right? Exactly like that, I think human beings totally love conversations, right? Both to be a part of them and to be a fly on the wall and really listen into those particular conversations as a way of entertaining themselves, sometimes educating themselves, learning, right? So if you look at it from that lens, I think podcasts are here to stay, right?
yeah,
Now, again, you may consume them sometimes on a TV, right? So
yeah,
many podcasts are now getting just consumed on the TV because people are watching so much of YouTube on TV, right? And a lot of people may prefer the audio format, a lot of people may prefer the video format, but our podcasts here to stay, right? I would bet all
mm,
my money and more on the fact that this is something that is here to stay, right? And it's not a temporary trend
yeah,
of any sort, right? Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. I think this is a good first episode, Rosh. What do you think?